Imagine two children born on the same day in India. Same country, same constitution, same laws that promise them equality. One is born into an upper caste family. The other is born a Dalit. That difference, that single fact of birth, will on average cost the second child 5 years of their life. Not because of any choice they make. Not because of any disease they carry. Not because of any failure of will or character. Simply because of the caste they were born into. Look at the numbers. Upper caste populations in India live, on average, 68 years. Other backward classes live 65.1 years. Scheduled tribes, 64 years. Scheduled castes, 63.1 years. Each step down the caste hierarchy is another step toward an earlier grave. 5 years. It sounds clinical when stated as a statistic. But think about what 5 years means. It is watching a grandchild take their first steps. It is seeing a daughter graduate. It is 5 more monsoons, 5 more harvests, 5 more birthdays surrounded by the people you love. 5 years of sunrise. 5 years of being alive. And hundreds of millions of Dalits in India are being robbed of those years. Not by accident, not by fate, but by a system that was built to exclude them and has never fully stopped. This is not ancient history. This is measured. This is documented. This is happening right now in every state, in every district, in every village where a Dalit family lives shorter lives than their neighbors, for no reason other than the caste they were born into. The data is not ambiguous. The gap is not small. Caste still predicts how long Indians live, and that is a moral catastrophe dressed in statistics. When confronted with the life expectancy gap, a comfortable response is to say, it is about poverty. Fix poverty, fix the gap. But the evidence refuses to let us off that easily. Yes, the poorest Indians live dramatically shorter lives than the richest. That wealth gap alone spans 7.6 years of life, wider than the equivalent gap in the United Kingdom. Economic deprivation is real, and it kills people. But here is the fact that should shake every policymaker, every doctor, every citizen out of complacency. Even after researchers controlled for poverty, after they accounted for rural residents, land ownership, income, sanitation, a substantial life expectancy gap remained. Adivasi men still faced more than 3 unexplained years of early death. Dalit men, more than 2. The gap did not disappear when you removed the economics. Something else is killing these people. There are 6 forces at work. Economic deprivation. Educational inequality, because 83% of the child mortality gap is tied to how much education a Dalit parent was allowed to receive. Healthcare barriers. Physical distance, out-of-pocket costs that consume an entire family's income, and the daily reality of being turned away, ignored, or humiliated in clinics and hospitals. Structural discrimination. The invisible weight of being treated as lesser in every institution you enter. Biological stress effects. The damage that chronic discrimination physically inflicts on the human body, through pathways we now understand with scientific precision. And regional inequality, the accident of geography that places Dalit and Adivasi communities in the states and districts where healthcare infrastructure is thinnest. These forces do not operate independently. They multiply each other. Poverty compounds discrimination. Discrimination compounds healthcare barriers. Barriers compound biological damage. Together, they form a cage around the lives of SC and ST populations, one they were born into, one they did not build, and one that most of them will never fully escape. This is not individual failure. This is structural violence. And calling it anything less is a lie. What if I told you that every act of humiliation leaves a physical scar? Not a metaphorical scar. A measurable biological scar. In the blood, in the cells, in the very machinery of the immune system? That is not a political argument. That is science. The field is called Psychoneuroimmunology. It studies how psychological experience, specifically chronic stress, rejection, and social exclusion, alters the biology of the human body at a molecular level. And what it has found should change the way we think about caste discrimination forever. When a person is humiliated, excluded, or treated as lesser, the brain activates the same biological systems it would use to respond to a physical attack. Stress hormones flood the body. Inflammatory signals surge through the bloodstream. The immune system shifts. The innate inflammatory side becomes chronically overactive, while the adaptive defenses that fight specific infections weaken. The body is perpetually braced for a wound that never stops coming. For someone who experiences this occasionally, the system recovers. But for a Dalit or Adivasi person navigating caste-based discrimination every single day, at the clinic, in the market, in the school, the system never gets to rest. The inflammation never fully resolves. The telomeres, the protective caps on chromosomes that determine cellular lifespan, shorten faster. The epigenome shifts, making inflammatory pathways more trigger-ready. Biological age races ahead of chronological age. And then the diseases arrive. Heart disease, diabetes, depression, chronic illness. Not because of genetics, not because of personal choices, but because the immune system has been ground down by decades of being treated as subhuman. This is the truth that changes everything. Caste discrimination does not merely diminish a life. It physically dismantles the body. The exclusion becomes inflammation. The humiliation becomes cellular damage. The discrimination becomes an early grave. Social inequality may literally become embedded in the body. And when it does, it kills quietly, invisibly, while the world looks away and calls it poverty. We need to be precise about what we are looking at, because how we name a problem determines how urgently we respond to it. Hundreds of millions of Indians are dying years earlier than they should. The life expectancy gap between Dalit communities and upper caste populations has persisted across decades of economic growth, across policy reforms, across governments of every political stripe. The gap did not close during the good years. And when COVID-19 arrived, it widened in a single year. Ask yourself, if a pathogen were killing Dalit and Adivasi communities at this scale, cutting 5 years from hundreds of millions of lives, persisting across generations, resisting every incremental intervention, what would we call it? We would call it an emergency. We would mobilize. We would declare a crisis and act with urgency. But because the killer is structural, because it operates through poverty and exclusion and humiliation and chronic biological damage, rather than through a microbe, we have allowed ourselves the luxury of treating it as a long-term problem, requiring patient, gradual progress. That framing is a choice, and that choice is costing lives. 3 conditions together define an emergency. First, severe, avoidable loss of life, and a gap of nearly 5 years of life expectancy, affecting hundreds of millions of people, is precisely that. Second, the burden concentrated in the most vulnerable, marginalized communities, and SC and ST populations are exactly that. Third, the problem persists across generations despite policy efforts, and decades of data confirm that it does. Every single trigger for emergency action has already been met. The life expectancy gap exceeds 5 years. Premature mortality in SC and ST populations remains far above national averages. Crisis events like COVID-19 widen the inequalities rather than equalizing them. Discrimination-related healthcare failures continue to be documented. Passive monitoring is not a response. Gradual policy adjustment is not a response. Treating this as a normal inequality issue that will sort itself out over decades is not a response. This is a public health emergency. The only question left is whether those with the power to act will finally find the will to do so. Declaring an emergency means nothing without a plan. And this is one. Not a wish list. Not a set of aspirational goals with no timeline. A phased, concrete 60-month framework, because the people dying at the bottom of this gap do not have the luxury of waiting for a vision document to become policy. In the first 12 months, right now, immediately, 3 things must happen. A national SC and ST longevity dashboard must be built and made public, so that the gap can no longer be hidden in aggregate statistics that mask what is happening to specific communities in specific districts. Every high-risk district must be identified and named. And anti-discrimination enforcement in healthcare settings must begin, because Dalit women being humiliated during childbirth, Dalit patients being given less time and less information by their doctors, is not a cultural nuance. It is a medical failure and a legal violation, and it must be treated as such. Fast-track grievance systems. Mental health and trauma-informed services that acknowledge what chronic discrimination does to a human body. These are not luxury interventions. They address the biological damage that is happening right now, in real time to real people. In the following 2 years, the funding must follow the need. Equity-adjusted healthcare funding means that the areas with the greatest burden receive the greatest resources, not equal funding, but just funding. Community health workers must be expanded and supported in the communities where trust in the formal system has been destroyed by generations of discrimination. Chronic disease continuity of care, because the inflammatory diseases driven by chronic stress require sustained management, not episodic treatment. And in the final phase, the structural foundations must be rebuilt. Health equity reviews across every government ministry, because health outcomes are shaped by housing policy, education policy, labor law, and criminal justice. A parliamentary review of caste-linked mortality, because if a parliament does not examine what is killing its most marginalized citizens, it has failed its most basic function. This framework combines healthcare reform, legal accountability, and structural policy change. Not one of these alone will close the gap. Together, they have a chance. The plan exists. The evidence exists. The obligation exists. What must now exist is the political will to implement it, because every month of delay is measured in lives. Let us end where the evidence has brought us. The life expectancy gap between scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, and upper caste populations in India is large. It is persistent, it is systemic. And it is reinforced not only by the social structures that produce poverty and exclusion, but by the biological pathways through which those structures burn themselves into the human body. Discrimination is not only a moral wrong. It is not only a social injustice. It is a long-term biological risk environment. Every day inside it alters the chemistry of the blood. Every year inside it shortens the cellular lifespan. Every generation inside it passes the damage forward, encoded in epigenetic markers that the next generation inherits before they have lived a single day of their own. Look at the body in this image. Social inequality enters as discrimination, as chronic stress, as exclusion, and it exits as inflammation, as accelerated aging, as chronic disease risk. This is not a metaphor. This is a documented biological pathway that ends, for too many millions of people, in premature death. Ask yourself the broader question this evidence demands. If a society consistently produces unequal survival outcomes across social groups, if it reliably gives some of its people 5 fewer years to live based on the family they were born into, should that be treated as normal? Or should it be treated as a national emergency? Without an emergency-oriented response, these inequalities will reproduce. Not merely continue, reproduce. The next generation of Dalit and Adivasi children will be born into the same biological inheritance of stress-primed immune systems, shortened telomeres, and accelerated aging. The same structures will surround them. The same humiliations will accumulate in their bloodstream. And 20, 30, 40 years from now, researchers will measure the gap again and find it unchanged or wider. The evidence is clear. The gap is real. The lives are at stake. Not in theory. Not in projections. Right now. Today. Every day that passes without emergency-level action, the gap claims more years from more lives that were never fairly lived to begin with. This is India's moment to decide what it stands for. The data has done its work. The science has done its work. The question that remains is a human one. Will those with power choose to act as if every life, every Dalit life, every Adivasi life, matters as much as any other? The answer to that question will be written in the life expectancy data of the next generation.